In the early 1600s, England was a relatively small kingdom on the edge of Europe, anxious, divided, and overshadowed by older, richer empires. It had just fought bitter religious conflicts, lost colonies, and watched Spain and Portugal dominate the oceans. Yet over the next 4 centuries, ships flying the Union Jack would circle the globe, trade would knit continents together, and British power would touch every ocean and almost every shore. At its height, the British Empire ruled over hundreds of millions of people and controlled key routes from Canada to India, from Africa to the Pacific. How did a collection of risky trading ventures and fragile colonies become the largest empire in history and then unravel in a single turbulent century? This is the story of the rise, transformation, and fall of the British Empire over roughly 400 years and how it helped shape the modern world. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, English ambitions turned outward across the seas. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 gave the kingdom confidence, but Spain and Portugal still commanded most of the known trade routes. English rulers and merchants responded with charters to new trading companies and colonial ventures. In 1600, the East India Company was founded to seek spices and textiles in Asia. In 1607, Jamestown was established in Virginia, a fragile English foothold on the American coast. Early colonies were small, hungry, and often close to collapse, plagued by disease, conflict with indigenous peoples, and mismanagement. Privateers and settlers pushed into the Caribbean, eyeing sugar islands and Spanish fleets. Religion, profit, and rivalry mixed together, sending more ships west and south each year. These first outposts were hardly an empire yet, but they laid down the roots of a wider Atlantic and Indian Ocean presence that would soon expand dramatically. In the mid-1600s, England was torn apart by civil war between king and parliament, followed by the rule of Oliver Cromwell, and then a restored monarchy. While armies fought at home, the Atlantic colonies in North America and the Caribbean struggled but survived. After the wars, London's leaders turned the empire into a tool of national power. Navigation Acts tried to keep colonial trade within English hands. Planters seized or founded sugar islands like Barbados and Jamaica, where enslaved Africans were forced to work in brutal conditions. The Royal African Company and other traders carried people across the Atlantic, turning slavery into a core part of the imperial economy. At the same time, England fought a series of naval wars with the Dutch, seeking control of sea routes and ports, such as New Amsterdam, later New York. By the late 1600s, an English, soon British, Atlantic empire of tobacco, sugar, and slaves was taking shape. In the early 1700s, the kingdoms of England and Scotland united to form Great Britain under the Acts of Union in 1707. This political union gave London access to Scottish manpower, capital, and maritime skills, strengthening its position in Europe. Britain fought the War of the Spanish Succession and later conflicts against France and its allies, seizing key forts, islands, and trading posts. The Royal Navy grew into a powerful instrument, escorting convoys, blockading enemies, and protecting merchant shipping. In North America and the Caribbean, British settlers and planters expanded inland and along the coasts, pushing indigenous peoples back and clashing with rival European colonies. By mid-century, the 7 Years' War brought global fighting from Canada to India. Victories like the capture of Quebec in 1559 weakened France and opened vast new territories to British control. Out of these wars, Britain emerged as a major imperial and naval power, but new tensions were already forming across the Atlantic. In the late 1700s, Britain seemed stronger than ever in North America.
It had pushed France out of Canada, controlled the Atlantic coast, and claimed lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. But the costs of war were high, and London tried to raise revenue through new taxes and tighter control over the colonies. Many American colonists, who saw themselves as loyal Britons, resisted measures like the Stamp Act and Tea Act. insisting on no taxation without representation. Protests turned into crisis, then into open war in 1775. France and Spain joined the rebels, turning the conflict into a wider struggle. Despite its powerful navy and professional army, Britain could not crush the rebellion or hold such a vast territory by force. Could an empire stay united when its subjects demanded rights rather than orders? In 1783, Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The loss was a shock, but British attention soon shifted toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. In the 1700s, as Britain fought European rivals at sea, the East India Company turned from trading to ruling in South Asia. Company agents built fortified factories along the coasts, buying textiles and spices from Indian merchants and princes. The crisis of the Mughal Empire and regional wars opened chances for intervention. In 1757, after the Battle of Plassey in Bengal, the company gained control over rich revenues and began to shape local government. Over the next decades, it used alliances, treaties, and wars to extend its influence across large parts of the subcontinent. Indian soldiers, the sepoys, filled its armies, commanded by British officers. New land taxes, legal codes, and trade patterns favored company interests but disrupted older elites and rural communities. Famines, corruption scandals, and debates in London raised questions about this private empire overseas. By the mid-1800s, resentment and anxiety in India were rising, setting the stage for a major explosion. At the turn of the 19th century, Britain faced revolutionary and then Napoleonic France in a struggle that spanned Europe, the oceans, and distant colonies. The Royal Navy's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 confirmed British control of the seas, even as armies on the continent rose and fell. While blockading France and its allies, Britain captured or secured strategic colonies such as the Cape of Good Hope, key Caribbean islands, and bases in the Indian Ocean. In North America, war with the United States in 1812 ended in stalemate, but British Canada survived. In the Pacific, a penal colony founded at Sydney in 1788 grew slowly into a British presence in Australia. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, no European rival could match Britain's combination of navy, finance, and overseas possessions. From London's perspective, the empire was now both a shield and a sword, protecting trade routes and projecting power into almost every major ocean. A new imperial age was beginning. In the early 1800s, the heart of British power shifted from fields and docks to coal mines, factories, and railways. The Industrial Revolution turned Britain into the workshop of the world, producing textiles, iron, and machinery on a massive scale. In 1807, Parliament banned the slave trade, and in 1833, it abolished slavery across most of the empire, though former slaves often remained trapped in harsh labor systems. Steamships and telegraphs linked London more tightly to distant colonies, speeding decisions and trade. Britain promoted a vision of free trade, lowering tariffs at home, while using its navy and diplomacy to open markets abroad, from Latin America to China. Wars like the Opium Wars forced new ports open, embedding British merchants deep into Asian commerce. Raw cotton, tea, and other goods flowed in. Finished products and capital flowed out. The empire was now not only a chain of territories, but also a global economic system centered on British industry and finance. By the mid-1800s, company rule in India had become both sprawling and fragile.
New rivals, pay disputes, and fears over religious pollution helped trigger the Great Uprising of 1857 as sepoys and local leaders rose against British authority from Meerut to Delhi and beyond. The revolt was brutal on all sides, with massacres, sieges, and harsh reprisals leaving deep scars. In its aftermath, London dissolved the East India Company and brought India under direct crown rule in 1858. The British Raj was proclaimed, and in 1877, Queen Victoria took the title Empress of India. Railways, telegraphs, and canal projects spread, linking cities and markets, while a growing civil service tried to enforce order and codify law. Yet economic hardship, racial hierarchy, and devastating famines revealed the limits and costs of imperial control. Could an empire built on such unequal foundations remain stable forever? By 1900, India was the jewel in the crown, but also a place where new nationalist voices were beginning to be heard. In the late 1800s, British power reached its Victorian peak. The Industrial Revolution had filled London's banks and factories, and politicians and businessmen now looked to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific for markets, raw materials, and prestige. During the Scramble for Africa, Britain seized or consolidated control over Egypt, Sudan, large parts of East and Southern Africa, and territories along the West African coast. Treaties, protectorates, and military expeditions carved new borders across older kingdoms and societies. At the same time, self-governing dominions like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand gained more autonomy while remaining within the imperial framework. Missionaries, engineers, and colonial officials promoted railways, schools, and administrative reforms, but also enforced racial hierarchies and disrupted local systems. The empire was displayed proudly at exhibitions, and maps colored huge areas in British red. To many in London, it seemed that the British Empire had become a global system that would endure indefinitely. Yet beneath this confidence, pressures and rivalries were quietly building. In 1914, the British Empire stood at its territorial height, linking Canada, India, Africa, and Australasia in what some called a world state. When the First World War began, millions of soldiers from across the empire fought under the British flag, from the trenches of the Western Front to campaigns in the Middle East and Africa. Victory in 1918 brought new territories, such as mandates in the former Ottoman lands, but also deep wounds. The war strained finances, shook confidence in European rule, and inspired new political expectations among colonial subjects. In Ireland, years of conflict led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, shrinking the United Kingdom itself. In India, movements led by figures like Gandhi organized mass protests and demands for self-government. The Great Depression further undermined trade and trust in imperial promises. By the 1930s, Britain still ruled a huge empire, but it was now facing rising nationalism, economic crisis, and the threat of new global war. A harsher test was coming. In 1939, Britain once again found itself at war with Germany, this time in a conflict even larger and more destructive than the last. The empire's resources were mobilized on a massive scale. Indian, African, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand forces fought in North Africa, Europe, and Asia. But early defeats, such as the fall of Singapore in 1942, shattered the myth of European invincibility in Asia. The Japanese advance exposed the vulnerability of imperial rule, while bombing and shortages at home showed British citizens the cost of global commitments. To survive, Britain heavily relied on American loans and material support, deepening a new power imbalance. When victory finally came in 1945, Britain stood on the winning side, but its economy was exhausted and its prestige weakened. Across the empire, soldiers and civilians who had sacrificed in the war now pressed harder for independence. The empire structure that had once seemed permanent was visibly cracking. After 1945, the British Empire entered its final rapid transformation. In 1947, India and Pakistan gained independence, accompanied by the trauma of partition and mass migrations. This moment signaled that even the jewel in the crown could not be held. Over the next decades, nationalist movements and negotiated settlements ended British rule across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Ghana, in 1957, followed by Nigeria, Kenya, and many others, moved from colony to nation-state. The 1956 Suez Crisis exposed Britain's reduced power as the United States and the Soviet Union overshadowed the old European empires. One by one, territories chose independence, association, or a new kind of partnership within the Commonwealth of Nations, a loose group of former colonies and the UK. By the late 20th century, with the handover of Hong Kong in 1997, the age of formal empire was essentially over. What remained was a network of cultural, economic, and political ties linking very different countries. From fragile outposts and trading companies on the edge of Europe, the British Empire grew into a global system linking continents, peoples, and markets, then retreated just as quickly in the 20th century. Wars with European rivals, the loss of the American colonies, company conquest in India, industrial might, the scramble for Africa, and 2 world wars all pushed the empire to expand, adapt, and finally break apart. At its core, this was the story of how a small island kingdom used sea power, finance, industry, and alliances, alongside coercion, inequality, and violence, to build a world-spanning empire, and how nationalism, economic strain, and changing ideas of justice eventually brought it down. Without centuries of British rule, would today's global map, languages, and institutions look the same? Many borders, legal systems, parliamentary traditions, railways, trade routes, and even popular sports still carry its imprint, as do deep grievances and ongoing debates about empire and memory. That complex legacy is one reason our world looks the way it does today. If you enjoyed seeing centuries of history condensed into a short story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Tell me in the comments which empire or region you want to see in our next episode.